Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And if you are tired of picking between the lesser of two evils and news presented in either red or blue, you are not alone. And every week we discuss the structural issues driving dysfunction in Washington and the reforms that can fix it. Now, if you've listened to this podcast before, you will know that the key driver behind the polarization and divisiveness in American politics is our system of elections, and reforming it is the first step towards getting the country back on track. And after electoral reforms suffered a series of losses at the state level in November, a surprising new ally has emerged in the battle to put people ahead of the parties. Kansas Republicans. Yes, you heard me correctly. We are going to talk about the recent endorsement of electoral reform by a prominent member of the GOP in the state and whether this reform has legs. But first, so Shawn, I guess I'll start off. I knew the White House had a gift shop, and I guess they're selling Teslas now.
Guess so.
Did you see?
I saw that. You know what actually amazed me was how quickly this went in and out of the news cycle. Because I felt like there was going to be a bigger deal made of the fact that the White House turned into a Tesla dealership for a day. But it seemed to be in and out of the news cycle pretty quickly. And I think part of it is just even the media has just kind of slumped into this, well, Trump's going to do what Trump does kind of mentality. Even under another president, we would consider this weird. But under Trump, it's just kind of like weird's the norm.
Isn't that funny? On one hand, you want the media to cover the more important things, like, for example, the current funding bill ahead of the Senate. On the other hand, a president is hawking cars in front of the White House. That's notable. Yeah. I mean, that's a piece of weirdness I'd like them to hover over a little bit longer. I have to say, I don't think there's a president who I could picture driving less than Donald Trump.
Well, he can't, apparently, because during his whole sales pitch for Tesla, he mentioned that he's not even allowed to drive. Like, it all became a meme and it all became a joke online. But what we witnessed was a serious violation of ethics by a president who was reduced to a salesman for a CEO who spent hundreds of millions of dollars to get him elected and then committed another $100 million to MAGA this past week.
I don't know. Have you ever seen the videos of like cats when they're like just like almost playing like they're going to knock something off the shelf and the owner's like, don't, sprinkles, don't, sprinkles. And then the cat eventually knocks it off. I feel like Trump is doing that with outrage. Let me see if I can get this one past them. Mm-hmm. You know, I will say just as an aside, Trump's taken a lot of heat for not doing enough to address inflation. And I don't think anybody's talking about how much lower the price of Tesla stock is right now. So
it's been a bad couple of weeks for Elon Musk, for sure, between his court losses with Doge and the fact that Tesla stock was already on the decline before recession fears caused that free fall this week in the stock market. It was already on the decline because not only of a national boycott, but a global boycott because people are just not liking him like they used to.
Oh, well, the funniest thing is like people, you know, you've got I don't know what the models are. You've got the sedans, Tesla, those all seem to sell pretty well. The Cybertrucks, I mean, never. Like, it looks like an oven hood. I don't think, before Musk entered politics, I don't think people like those things.
It's really an ugly car, to be honest. And I think a lot of people, if they were just honest with themselves, would admit that the Cybertruck is pretty ugly. But there's a huge gap there between the Model S, which is the more sedan Tesla, that's $36,000, versus the Cybertruck, which is north of $100K. So the big gap there.
I've never been so proud as a parent than when my son came home and said he was out riding bikes with his friends and they saw a Cybertruck and they booed it. They just all started booing. And I just think it's great. Like, you go out and you buy a car the price of a house, and then a bunch of middle schoolers start booing you on the side of the street. I mean, that to me, they say there's no justice in the world. That to me is justice right there. That's justice. So that's fun. Moving on from that, uh, the story of the week was former Kansas House Majority Leader Don Hineman, a Republican, recently endorsing fusion voting as a path for moderate Republicans to exercise their voting power as Trumpism has taken over the party. And Heineman's opinion was that Kansas Republicans were really once associated with more practical moderates. So you had Dwight Eisenhower, and now they just all feel politically homeless. And so his argument was that fusion voting, which was once used in Kansas in the 1800s, so a while back, would give them more power. So, Shawn, you're probably going to do a better job of explaining this. So, could you talk about what fusion voting is exactly?
Yeah, so just to put it simply, fusion voting is when a candidate can be endorsed by more than one party or nominated by more than one party. So let's say you had a center-right candidate, the type of candidate that Republican in Kansas is talking about. He can be endorsed by both the Republican Party and maybe a more moderate party that might emerge in Kansas. And this is something that has existed in America to various degrees since the early days of our republic, something we'll get to in a bit. Nowadays, it's only seen in very select few locations because many states have banned it because the majority party figured out or realized that it could be used as a tool to usurp their majority.
So, that was really interesting. So, when I read this story, and I'll preface what I'm going to say by admitting that I tend to be dismissive of a lot of different varieties of electoral reform. And part of my reasoning behind it is I really think that reforming our elections is an urgent matter, and we can't get bogged down in the minutia. We just have to pick a lane, pick the system that is going to be the most effective, that is the most palatable to voters, and move on. And I think a lot of times what happens in the electoral reform movement is, the math nerds come out and they're like, well, you get, X percentage better with this and Y percentage better with that. And nobody cares.
Right.
Nobody cares.
Right.
Right. I don't think there's any evidence I need to provide to tell you that Americans don't like math. Right.
Yeah.
I think that should just be a given. So that out of the way, I had seen fusion voting mentioned a number of times, kind of lumped it in with the reforms that I didn't feel were going anywhere, and then went along my happy way. But once I heard this story, I actually became really interested in the idea until I talked to you. And I'm going to let you pour water on my fire in a little bit, but I want to go into kind of what I thought was cool about it.
Yeah.
And then you can go on to kind of give your take. Because what fusion voting really allows people to do is group themselves under common interests. So where smaller parties typically don't have a lot of power under the current system of elections or under the system of elections used in most states because they just can't garner enough votes, fusion voting allows a smaller party to endorse another candidate, to effectively use their ballot line to put, let's say, a Democratic candidate or a Republican candidate that aligns with their views. And I found this really interesting because what it allows voters to do is break off into ideological subgroups and then incentivizes those running to campaign for those subgroups to build a winnable coalition. And so I thought that was really cool. Now, I know you have a different opinion, and you also have a little bit more perspective on the history behind fusion voting.
Yeah, so in the early days of our republic, fusion voting was used to help critical social movements kind of gather their resources and their manpower together to get representation at all levels of government. The abolitionist movement being one of the most critical movements that fusion voting is credited for helping grow. And so you saw parties like the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party emerge from abolitionist groups, find representation at all levels of government, which helped then build the movement even more. And so it served a critical function for both representation for these movements and for other minor parties that you saw throughout the 19th century, parties that people have never heard of, like the Anti-Monopoly Party, the Silver Party, all these parties that Americans today have never even heard of, got representation as a result of things like fusion voting. Now, the only issue I really have with fusion voting is that in the current political environment, it's not really a practical solution to affect change as a result of how our system works today. The fact that 90% of our elections are decided in low turnout party primaries means that if a party wants to use fusion voting to help realign it back to a more moderate position, like that Kansas Republican wants to do, it's not really going to work because the Republican Party already has a majority in most districts in Kansas. And anywhere where they do have a majority, they're pretty much guaranteed a win. So the Republican Party is going to nominate their candidate, whoever it's going to be. And because of how primary elections work, we're seeing these candidates move further and further to the extremes. But even if, say, a moderate party were to emerge and try to realign the Republican Party in some way, they wouldn't be able to do that because they if they just nominate the extreme candidate, then that defeats the purpose.
And when you said that, that really gelled with me, because I feel like even when we're talking about the era where fusion voting was popular, the groups that really leveraged it were groups organized around hot button issues,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think the political environment we have now, the groups organized around hot button issues are the two major parties. So I don't know whether it would give a voice to the folks in the middle. I would say that if we look at a state like Kansas and we have a group of Republicans who feel left out of the process, fusion voting might give room for them to found a more moderate conservative party. And I think this puts us back in a space where we were last week when we talked about how maybe the best strategy for Democrats to defeat MAGA is just to leave red states altogether and to let the GOP fracture and split its own vote. So yeah, I'd agree with you there. I'm not 100% sure whether it would do the trick. That out of the way, if we look at its current usage, it's currently used in New York State. Generally, what we see is that it is used by more, I guess we'll call them ideologically extreme parties to give power to one of the two major parties. So, for example, the Conservative Party helped George Pataki win in 1994 over Mario Cuomo. And in 2018, Andrew Cuomo, Mario's son, won in part due to his support by the far left Workers' Family Party. So I would say there's evidence of groups on the fringes of American politics being able to reduce the potential spoiler effects against one of the two major parties, but it's not actually doesn't seem to be doing much to change the direction of the two major parties from what I've seen.
Yeah, so New York is an interesting case because, like you said, both the Working Families Party and the Conservative Party have been able to use their own nomination and endorsement to help broaden appeal for the respective major party that they wanted to support. However, what the audience may not know is that there are only two recognized minor parties in New York right now, and that is the Working Families Party and the Conservative Party, because of rule changes that date back to December of 2019, where they raised the number of votes that third parties need in order to keep their ballot line, but also made it so that they need to meet these requirements every 2 years. So the same votes that they get in a presidential election, they have to be able to get in a midterm election, which for minor parties is a very hard thing to do. So this also raises an issue with fusion voting. It's a great idea. I like fusion voting. I don't see why it shouldn't be legal in every state. But when you have the majority party in each state effectively deciding election rules, if you bring up an idea like fusion voting, the majority can just go, okay, we're just going to make it harder for third parties to gain party recognition and ballot status.
Yeah, and we're kind of back to where we were before, where the dominant party in any state is going to fight any reform that potentially reduces its ability to dictate who's on the ballot and who ultimately wins.
Yeah.
I do think what is interesting about this story coming out of Kansas is how it does highlight the fractures within the GOP. Because we talk about how the Democrats are in disarray. And I think that's a flattering term because you with disarray, you'd expect to at least see them somewhere, right?
Mhm.
But, I think we tend to misjudge the GOP as this unified ideological monolith. And I think the reality is there are a lot of Republicans right now who aren't happy with Trump's more erratic choices. So, for example, the tariffs. And there are also a lot of Republican exiles. And there are a lot of folks like, again, Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, Jeff Flake. I mean, I could go on. Anyone who has not pledged fealty to Trump has been left out in the cold. And so I think there's a whole universe of Republicans who are up for grabs in a lot of ways if a more moderate conservative party can find a foothold somewhere.
And I think you are seeing increasingly more members of the two major parties get behind systemic reform in a way that we haven't seen in the past, because Liz Cheney proposed a third party to emerge to help realign the Republican Party, and ultimately this plan for fusion voting is meant to act the same way for the Republican Party. They think they can achieve what the Republicans were able to achieve in the progressive era by kind of forcing the party back into realignment to a more moderate position.
Yeah.
And it won't work the same way because of all the systemic barriers that have been erected since then to prevent that from happening ever again.
Yeah, there's a couple things I want to say to that. First, to bring anyone up to speed who isn't familiar with what we're talking about during the progressive era, that was a time when Teddy Roosevelt actually broke off from the Republican Party due to ideological disagreements to form the Progressive Party. Now, Progressive Party gained a couple of seats in Congress, ultimately tilted the election in favor of the Democrats. But really, what it did more than produce any lasting political party is it helped realign the Republican Party. And I think there's definitely some credence to the idea that the same thing could happen here. The second thing you said, which was really interesting and something I found out while I was doing my research on fusion voting, is that as much as I've always lauded the progressive era as this point in history where we really made a meaningful impact on how we elect people to government, it resulted in the direct election of senators. It resulted in women being given the right to vote. It was also a big period where a lot of electoral systems that threatened two-party dominance were actually suppressed. And fusion voting was one of them.
So we talked a little bit about the impact that fusion voting has had on critical social movements in America's history, the most notable one being the anti-slavery movement. I find it interesting that we really haven't had a major social movement in the United States since the Civil Rights Movement. And I think you can look at the way that the system has been changed to erect such barriers, to get rid of things like fusion voting. All of these factors go in, because if these groups can't find a way to come together and form their own parties and find representation in government, then the change that they seek will never happen.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting wrinkle in there though, which is what I feel is that the current era that we are living in is a direct result of a two-party system that suppressed competition and as a result ignored a lot of constituencies. And now a lot of the instability we see is a direct result of a system that hasn't had the proper inputs. I mean, because one of the ways to look at elections, one of the ways to look at democracy is it's a signal to those in power as to the state of play in the country. And when you institute laws to dampen that signal, issues just get swept under the rug. And I think one I've cited time and time again is the Democrats ignoring the industrial Midwest. I think you could say the same thing about the Arab American community in Michigan. Some decided to sit the election out in 24, some decided to vote Republican. I think any system that can strengthen that signal and any system that can incentivize people to come together under core issues is better than none. Tying that to what you said about the civil rights era or the abolitionist movement, I'd agree there. There's no system for certain ideological groups to organize in a way that's meaningful. And so a lot of times they just metastasize in the form of people either voting for a third party candidate that they know isn't going to win, or just not voting at all.
And I think right now, to get back to something I was saying earlier, you're seeing more of these establishment members of these parties back sort of what I call low hanging fruit reforms, like fusion voting rather than systemic voting, because I think they want to return to an era pre-Trump where the status quo was still there, but they were the ones who ultimately had the power. There's no way for these more establishment members of the party to know where their party's going anymore because they have no idea what comes after Trump.
I would agree with you there. I mean, we've talked about this before, but there's really no MAGA without Trump. And I mean, who's going to take over? Like JD Vance? I mean, like seriously, give me a break. Yeah. And this is something we've said before. You know, I think that the idea that two parties are going to be satisfactory in an age where media is fragmented across multiple channels is as anachronistic as the idea that we're all going to watch the same 1 hour news broadcast on 3 networks. Like the way people get information and the way they are mobilized has fundamentally changed. I think the problem we're facing now is as much as people want to poo-poo social media, or as much as people want to poo-poo the idea that we're placing personality over politics, that is the state of play. Mm-hmm. And so we need to adjust the system to ensure that doesn't go awry. And I think what we've seen with the current Republican Party is we've seen how easy it is for a very small, motivated faction to effectively inhabit the major party apparatus like a hermit crab. And it could happen to the Democratic Party. Right. I mean, honestly, the best thing that could happen to the Democratic Party is for some celebrity to come in and be like, yep, I'm a Democrat now and I'm going to be president, right? Like whoever. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Ryan Seacrest, it doesn't matter. I mean, it really doesn't matter, right? We're already selling cars on the White House lawn. Why not? The irony, of course, is fusion voting was banned because it appeared to be a threat to the two major parties. And I would agree with you now that I think it's a half measure to keep the parties in control, but maybe just keep the right kind of party members in control.
Yeah, to your point, there is no going back. Everything that we're seeing today in our politics is a consequence of the system that was methodically erected in order to suppress competition and endorse the two major parties. But to your point, there's a lot of members of these parties who realize the damage that a system that doesn't allow for competition and only for a duopoly to reign is going to have even on their own party. So they're willing to offer up these kind of light solutions such as fusion voting, which they previously were against, as a way of trying to realign themselves. But at this point, it's the point of no return, I think, for the Republican Party. They're just going to keep moving more and more to the right because as their base shrinks, those are the people who are deciding in the primaries who's going to be their candidate. So,
Well, we just kicked the crap out of fusion voting, so maybe we ought to tell anyone listening what they can do or what does make sense. I think you and I are both aligned that the number one way to put power in the hands of the largest number of voters are open nonpartisan primaries. That creates a system where all candidates from all parties compete for all voters. And in some systems, the top 2 make it on the ballot. In some systems, the top 4 make it on the ballot. But the idea there is that you can't just appeal to your partisan base in a low turnout election and expect to make it to the general. You've really got to have broader appeal. I think that's one. I think multi-member districts is another one because it makes it much more difficult to gerrymander and also makes it so the threshold for getting elected is far lower. So if you have a 3-member district, 33% is all you need. That gives a lot of room for smaller parties to form and challenge a duopoly. Ranked choice voting is another one you and I are behind. I think all of these can work. I'm going to be really interested to see the fusion voting enthusiasts come out of the woodwork and just lambaste us. We'll find out.
The one thing I will say is I don't want advocates of fusion voting to think that we're saying it's a terrible idea. It's just there has to be deeper systemic reforms in order for fusion voting to actually have the impact that it's meant to have.
We will leave it there. Fusion voting enthusiasts, if you come at us, be gentle. We're delicate little flowers. Thank you very much for listening. If you liked what you heard today, Shawn and I have a simple request. A lot of us feel like we're stuck between political extremes and feel like we are caught in the crossfire between Team Red and Team Blue. And I know you're out there because we hear from you. And our goal with this podcast is really simple. It is to turn that frustration into political action. And so if you are one of the people who is tired of voting for the lesser of two evils, if you're one of the people tired of holding your nose every time you go to the ballot box, here's how you can help us. Subscribe to the podcast and share it with others who are tired of the same old partisan gamesmanship. Take a moment to rate the podcast and review us. It's going to help more people join the conversation and help increase the impact we can make. The music you are hearing is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.